Hi, how are you? All right. Good to start? Okay, we'd like to call the meeting to order. You want to do roll call or?
Roll call.
Okay. Board Member Yanis?
Present.
Board Member De La Sera? Okay. Board Member Fernandez?
Present.
Board Member Lasenio?
Present.
Board Member Senra? Vice Chair Matos?
Present.
Chairman Julia?
Present.
Chairman, you have quorum.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like everyone to rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. May be seated. Next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of our last meeting, which was October 23rd, 2019. If we have a motion to approve, or if there's any corrections.
I make a motion to approve.
And I'll second it.
We have a motion by Board Member Leoncio, seconded by Board Member Vice Chairman Matos. I think we could do a voice. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone
Aye.
opposed? No. Seeing no one opposed, the minutes are approved. So that takes us to the next item, which is really not quasi-judicial or anything like that. It's having to do with our mobility fee. So I'll turn it over.
Mr. Chair, that is correct. The item that's before you tonight is really the only item that you'll be discussing, and I will be excusing myself for a moment because I need to go upstairs, but if anything happens, please bring me back and I'll come back to the dais. Is an item that it's an ordinance of the Town Council of Miami Lakes, Florida relating to mobility fees, amending Chapter 13 Land Development Code at Article 10, Concurrency Regulations and Mitigation of Development Impacts, Division 2, Mobility Fee, providing for repeal of laws in conflict, providing for severability, providing for inclusion to the code, and providing for an effective date. The purpose of this ordinance, Mr. Chair, is to review the actual calculations, and Ms. Alonso will discuss these with you, and it's going to also address certain concerns that the council had and that were addressed during the actual workshop that we had with regards to mobility fees. And so tonight what you'll be doing is, and this is kind of exciting the way that it's being set up, is that you'll be reviewing this, making your recommendations, and these recommendations will immediately be heard next Tuesday at the council meeting. And I think that that's something that's pretty neat about changing the date that you guys are meeting, that it's going to have more of an immediate impact as far as the opinion and when it's received. So with that, I leave you with Ms. Alonso.
Good evening, board members and chairman. This item is, it's a little dense in concept, but it's actually very simple. Just as a method of introduction to the issue of mobility fees, I don't know how many of you are familiar with how mobility fees work. The state of Florida required all municipalities and all counties to have concurrency so that they can mitigate for any transportation, parks, sewer allocations, and schools impacts of new developments onto existing systems and infrastructure, right? So this concurrency was the law of the land for many years. Back in 2009, though, they decided that as far as transportation went, municipalities could opt out of continuing to do concurrency. The town of Miami Lakes was one of the pioneer municipalities that decided to take a new route and use one of the new tools that the state was allowing to use in order to mitigate impacts of transportation by transforming its concurrency system into a mobility fee system. The difference between a concurrency system and a mobility fee system is that the concurrency system is based on a level of service of the adjoining roads. It sort of prices the first come, first served situation for development, and it really, it actually has a lot of unintended consequences at the end of the day, which is the reasons that the town decided to go in that direction in 2015. Because we were one of the pioneering towns and one of the pioneering municipalities in the state of Florida, the original ordinance that was passed in 2015 was a very good first stab at it. And now 3 years later, we're revisiting it and maybe tightening up some of the language to make it a better process, to make it better for the applicants, better for the town, and remove some of the, shall we say, fat, some of the stuff that was making things way too onerous on the applicant, and maybe even making it more difficult for the town to collect the revenue that may be coming. That being said, I'm going to go a little bit over the things that we are changing, because what you're looking at right now is just the changes to the text. There will be a resolution in the next council hearing that will go with this ordinance where the actual amount of the rate per trip will be heard as well. But at this time, the only thing we're looking at is the ordinance that changes the text in order to change to fix how the procedures are implemented and how the calculations are made at the time of the calculation of the trips. So the current changes are designed to do the following things. Simplify the initial calculations by providing an initial set of trips for a set of common uses. And this is what you can find on that chart on the second page of the Exhibit A, where the text is changed. We're providing a chart of the most common uses. We're basically dividing it into residential, commercial, office versus medical office, and industrial uses. And then providing a set of trips that is assigned as to those based on ITE manual, the Institute of Transportation Engineers manual, the 10th edition. So these trips are directly out of the 10th edition of the manual, which is the current version, and it's the kinds of numbers that any transportation engineer would be using where they calculate in trips for mobility fee right now. We're removing a little bit of subjectivity from the process. These calculations for trips have a lot of assumptions baked in that the transportation engineers use in order to come up with the actual numbers of trips. By providing a simplified chart to begin with, sort of like a baseline, we are providing a lot less leadway for the back and forth of give me credit for that and let's take credit for the other thing. So it's a little more of a baseline. Applicants still have the right to contest that chart and to provide a more in-depth traffic study to maybe bring in more accurate trip calculations, but this allows the smaller applicants not to have to go through that step and not to have to hire a traffic engineer to come up with a baseline. The third thing it does is this removes the need for a professional traffic engineer, so that small and common applications can reduce the cost of calculating their mobility fees. Yes, thank you. The changes that we're making also add transparency to the ordinance, because it allows the applicants to estimate any possible fees in advance. So maybe when they're still choosing whether to come into the town of Miami Lakes, whether they're still choosing whether the development is in their best interest, they can calculate their fees more freely because this is available to them. Also, this will ensure that the maximum number of trips generated, whether it be weekday trips or weekend trips, is accounted for. So there's some uses like maybe theaters, churches, entertainment venues, maybe larger restaurants, where the number of trips on the weekend would be larger than the weekday trips. The previous ordinance required weekday trips, and sometimes we were being maybe too generous because it was shortchanging because their heaviest trips would be on the weekend. So we're now removing that problem and making sure that we account for the heaviest of the two. We're also, there was some credits that were given at the end of the calculation for new infrastructure and for bicycle facilities and other things. We are also cleaning up the credits that were very difficult to enforce, that were not easy to continuously monitor and make sure that they were still existing. So that, again, the credit system is a little cleaner, and we're adding penalties for failure to maintain conditions by which applicants are given credits. And this is, if you have any questions, I think it's important that you look at the structure of what we're proposing as far as the categories that that staff has proposed to break it up, because we could add or take away categories on that list at this point. It's an appropriate thing for you guys to suggest right now. And also see if, I would really appreciate your opinion as to how this procedure looks to you, as far as whether it's too onerous, too lenient, or whether or not we could add any steps in there that would help out in any way.
Okay. I have a couple questions.
I'm sure.
Normally in zoning, when we talk about calculating stuff for the restaurants, and just because I used to own restaurants, so there was a distinction made between dining area and kitchen. But here, it's only 1,000 square feet.
So parking requirements are calculated like you're speaking.
Right.
So when we're calculating parking requirements, which, by the way, parking requirements are usually loosely based on the same ITE manual that this is. So yes, a restaurant with a very large kitchen, a very small seating area would get a much bigger break in the parking. However, as far as the ITE manual, it does not distinguish between the two. And that is not, I can't tell you why. I don't really know why it doesn't distinguish between kitchen area and the, but it just goes by gross. And all I can tell you about that is that that's the way it's calculated as far as trips go. I know by the time we get to parking spaces, they do make a distinction in the same manual.
Right. I mean,
But
I'm just thinking,
it's a great
if for
question.
parking we adjust it, it's because we assume there's less parking required for the kitchen versus the dining. So I guess from a mobility perspective, if less cars, it would flow the same way. So that's just
With the
my-
giant caveat that I understand
engineer.
traffic engineering, but I am not a traffic
No,
engineer.
no.
So
I have
the
no
way
idea.
that I figure that works is that when you're doing parking, you are counting the cars that are going to be parked outside. So you're not counting maybe people that are coming in to pick up and drop off. Maybe you're not counting, because here you're counting employees that are being dropped off, and maybe they don't keep their car there because somebody else is moving. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the trip calculations are different by nature of the parking requirement in some ways.
Okay. And then at the end of the day, let's say this chart is approved. The way it's supposedly easier to calculate, if I'm going to come in and do a restaurant, I would take this 470.95. Let's say I'm going to do a restaurant fast casual of 1,000 square feet. What do? I do the 470.95 times $1?
One. So is per 1,000. So is the number of trips that you see there times the number of thousands.
But-
So if it's 1,000 square feet, it's one.
Right, but then I'm looking at the report that was submitted also in the back, and it's saying their total per trip fee, $449. So what we are saying is you multiply 470.95 times?
Not yet. Not yet. There's a one step in between that I have just passed out. Gina just passed out a little sheet. This is something that we're not changing either today or next week. This is not proposed to be changed. It's going to remain the same, and that's why it hasn't been included into your package. But I'm including it now so that you can at least see it for reference. The step in between those two is the mean auto occupancy. Our rate per trip is not based on the vehicle trips, which is what these calculate. These are vehicle trips. Our rate per trip is based on the mean auto occupancy. So, it's based on the passengers in the car, not in the number of cars. So it's basically how many people travel to your place on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, right? So this chart that you have as Exhibit A, right here is that Gina just passed out. That's how the mean auto occupancy has its own factor that you have to interject in the middle. So the first thing you do is you take the number of square feet,
Right, so let's just assume it's
And
1,000 square
it's-
feet.
Yeah, assume it's 1,000.
So it's
You
470.95.
multiply the 1 times the
So over here, let's
Yes.
say one of these restaurants is 1.32.
1.32, right?
So
you
that
get
gets me to 500
1
and
point,
change.
yeah, 1.32. That's, say
No,
that
I
again?
would multiply 470 times the 1.32.
100 is 112, right? No,
Right.
you don't multiply 1,000, you multiply 1, because it's per 1,000. Right. So you multiply 1. So the number of trips for a 1,000 square foot restaurant is 112. Okay? And that's the number of vehicle trips. Then we go to the other chart. This is a lot of fun. Then we go to the other chart. And you find restaurant here in this chart. And in this chart, restaurant is on the second page. And if it's a high quality restaurant,
Well, they're
the
all-
number is 1.321. So you multiply 112 times 1.321. And that tells you that on a regular basis, every
Oh, the thing is that I was using I was saying 470 because I'm using the restaurant fast food.
so restaurant fast food. So you're doing like a fast food restaurant. Gotcha.
Right.
So fast food drive-through is 1.321 too. So sorry, it's the same number.
Right, that's what I was saying. So
Right.
basically, I take that 470,
470 times 1.321.
so that's 470 times 1.32,
And that's the number of trips that you're going to then
so
calculate
it's
by whatever
500
the rate
and
is.
something.
Yes.
And now I multiply that 500 and something times $449.
Yes.
So in order for someone to open up a fast food restaurant of 1,000 square feet, they have to pay $253,000 mobility fee.
So not yet. Today, as it stands today, the rate per trip is 160.
No, I
The
saw that.
400 is going to be presented to the council next week. It's up to them whether they're going to keep that or amend it in any way. It's what,
Because when I did that calculation, and I didn't even multiply it times the 1.32, and it came out to $200,000, and I went like, point of observation, I don't think anybody's going to open up a new fast food restaurant in Miami Lakes because it's unaffordable.
But in fairness, though, the way that before, if we were calculating based on the previous method, it would have been about the same anyway, right?
no, it would have been, if you were so if you're calculating for the previous method, it would be up to whatever engineer they brought in, and they would provide their own calculation as to what their restaurant was going to produce. Remember that a fast food restaurant particularly is a restaurant that is nominally made to be very condensed in space and provide a lot of service to a lot of people. That's why it's a fast food, it's volume. They sell volume. So yes, a fast food restaurant by nature will create a whole lot of trips. More than a similarly sized restaurant where people sit down to dinner. Because, again, a fast food restaurant by nature is going to be all kitchen, very little everything else. And will require very little parking, but it will require but it will create quite a bit of volume of sales. Does that make any sense? And that's why their rate would be very high. So you're really using the worst case scenario in this particular case. At the same time, I do have to make the caveat that you guys are not considering the actual rate per trip. What is put in front of you right now is just the procedure. The rate per trip is adopted by resolution and will be heard by the council next week. And it's not necessarily, as of right now, the rate is 160. It's not 400. So right now, if you do your calculation with 160, then you get the today number. Does that
Now,
make sense?
The way that the chart was created, when I looked at the report, it looked to me that according to that 10th edition of that engineer thing, it said and again, I'm using the worst case scenario because I just wanted to see the worst case scenario. On page 21, it talks about fast casual, and there it says the average vehicle trip rate per 1,000 square feet is 315.17 based on the 10th edition trip generation manual. However, on the chart, I see 470, and I don't know if I'm
This is where that's why we want to get the engineers out of the way precisely, because there's so much room for interpretation in these things. So the chart that they provided in order to get, so the charts that you see on the report that is not staff, the consultant's
Corradino.
report, the Corradino report, those are the ones that he used in order to create the number of trips. All right, so I have to back up a little. So the way our mobility fee works is a plan-based mobility fee. The way our mobility fee works is that the consultant goes and calculates all our capital projects that have to do with mobility. So everything that has to do with public transportation, everything that has to do with improvements to our existing structures, everything that has to do with enlarging level of service, everything that is our capital improvement projects for the next 20 years. Then come up with a number of trips that will be logically or possibly developed in those 20 years. So we have to basically make an estimate of how much development we expect in the next 20 years, and then divide that number of trips, divide that number of the money that would take to create all these projects by the number of trips that we forecast that may happen in the next 20 years. So the level, you see what I'm saying? There's like you're assuming and assuming and assuming and assuming. There's like several layers of assumptions. The numbers that he used in order to calculate the number of trips that will be created are conservative for that scenario, so that we wouldn't over-calculate the number of trips, overestimate the number of trips that would be created in the scenario where we're trying to divide by the money. Do you see what I'm saying? When you are trying to do the opposite, so when you're trying to create the number of trips, so the calculation that is appropriate for the code to be the base calculation should be conservative the other way. So on that one, they're being conservative and under, and in this one, we need to be conservative to the top, so that if they choose, and very honestly, a fast food restaurant that is coming in brand new from the ground, most likely is going to come in with their own traffic engineer, and they're going to come in and do their own traffic calculation, because it's going to be to their advantage to do that. And they're going to probably come in with some credits, and they're going to probably come in with a lot of things, as opposed to maybe a brand new little joint shack that is going in a corner that is not brand new, that is going into an existing restaurant space, but they're maybe changing the type of restaurant that it is. So most likely, the way that this chart is going to be used is for those changes of use, where we're trying to sort of ascertain at the beginning of a project, what is the difference between this and that?
The final thing that I had was, is there a way to, is there another part in the code that defines full service and fast food? Because I think it's a generally accepted term, but obviously if I would do a restaurant, I'm saying, no, I'm a full service, I'm not a fast food, because it's 3 to 1 or 4 to 1.
Good. We probably should insert some text that says that these are definitions as per the ITE manual, because these are definitions as per, these are not our code definitions, these are definitions that are explained in the Institute of Traffic Engineers manual. And yes, it's a good point.
If I can,
Please,
through the
yes.
chair, if you're finished.
Yeah.
So the reason this is coming in front of us is because it's timely. Am I correct? The manual is
Correct.
being updated. So it isn't that this is just arbitrarily coming to us. It's because it's time for it to come. So this comes in at like 3-year increments. Is that correct?
3-year increments, yes,
That the
ma'am.
manual is updated. And am I correct when I am understanding that this is, the mobility fee is charged, because you just said something that was contrary to what I understood. So anything that would be new construction is charged a mobility fee,
Yes, ma'am.
correct? And anything where there's a considerable change of use?
An intensification of use is the
Okay,
correct
so
term,
like
yes.
if we were going to go from, I'm going to just throw this out, like Elevate Church, when they changed to a different component in the church, would that have also
They did pay a sizable mobility fee, yes.
additional mobility fee?
Yes.
So if I'm understanding, the rates at this point are not what we're looking at.
No, we're not looking at the rate today, no.
But the guidelines that you've given us, quite frankly, this kind of throws you a little bit, because we didn't have that. And we talked about that, so I understood that that was forthcoming. But this chart is very narrow. So what if I'm a brewery? Okay, we've got a new land use potential coming in. What if I'm a brewery? So then I'm industrial and restaurant, based on what? What
So-
if I'm an art gallery?
So a brewery is an easy one, and art gallery is a little more interesting. But a brewery is very easy in this scenario, because a brewery is a combination of industrial and a restaurant. And you just take the square footage of the industrial add that in, and then take the square footage of the restaurant and calculate that accordingly. And you add the two, and you got your number of trips. That one is a simple one. Art gallery is not that simple, because an art gallery could be a very heavy usage on the weekend, and it could be, and that may be one that would benefit from its own assessment on the side, and maybe not going by the chart. They can do a base assumption that if they're a very heavily used art gallery, they may be more like like an office space, or if it's a storage gallery where they have a lot of open space and they're really not really, they're more storing the art than really presenting it, and maybe more like an industrial use. So that would be a use that would definitely benefit from their own study. What we're trying to do here is not necessarily remove the necessity that sometimes an engineer would be likely to be involved. It's more having to have it every time. Because the way that it is right now, the way that the code is written right now, the engineer has to be involved even in the little projects. And when you have a project that is going to end up paying maybe $3,000 worth of mobility fees, but they have to spend $3,000 on an engineer to calculate that number, and then another $3,000 for us to peer review that calculation, they're in the hole for $6,000, and the town still hasn't collected anything. And so this is it's just an attempt to maybe remove some of that out the gate so that we have a starting number to talk about. If the applicant is happy with that number, then they can go with that. If they're not happy with a number, they have procedures in place that they can go and rebut that number if it makes sense to calculate it differently. But at that point, yes, you are engaging an engineer.
So then personal services, those categories, obviously some of these things are subjective, am I correct, as to who determines what category it falls in? You, as the official, make that determination?
I make that kind of call on a regular basis in the sense that, when you have something that is very weird, like a brewery, I'm used to thinking of this is more like this and less like that. At the same time, removing as much of that uncertainty from the process and making it as clear as possible is also important. So, because, again, I may not be here forever. There will be other planners sitting on this chair, and you want to make it as clear cut as possible, so that there's not a giant transition in the interpretation, that the interpretations are nice and narrow and on the same.
So it removes some of the subjectivity from it.
Exactly.
Okay, would I be correct, and I'll wrap it up with this. The project at Windmill Gate, that was a recent project where the mobility fees came into play, am I correct? So it was a combined project where
I think
it was
some mobility
dollar for
fees went
dollar?
in there, and actually that's one of the dollar for dollar ones. And it was used, it was actually county fees. They were not those, because that was a grant project that was vested for mobility fees, but they were not vested for road impact fees, which they also have to pay to the county. And they used some of their credits with the county to use dollar for dollar into the 67th Avenue project. One of the credits that we're trying to add, we're removing some of the credits that we can't enforce, but one of the credits that we're trying to add is the dollar for dollar one, because it allows the town to basically have projects that are being planned for anyway. So they have to be projects that are being planned for already to be produced and developed by the applicant directly, without and they can get their own permitting, and with minimal involvement from the town. As far as project goes. Does that make sense?
Okay, so just one point of clarity. Obviously, we're not doing the rates. What we're doing now is just approving the process that you have in place, which,
Yes, ma'am.
if I'm understanding correctly, it's an attempt to have almost a fixed flat rate per, whatever category you fall under,
To start with.
to start with. In my opinion, I think all this gray or unknown or a better attempt to kind of mitigate that subjectivity is to define it, is to kind of put in as part of all this definitions as to what it all means in terms of, what is a restaurant fast food? What is restaurant full service? What is that versus having an individual decide, well, based on my opinion, I think this is what it falls, because you're right, tomorrow, you're not here and someone comes in, they may not have the same experience and understanding maybe that you do in doing this for all this time. But if it's defined, then the parameters are defined, and then you can do that.
And what we were thinking of doing was, adding the ITE as a, because at the end of the day, the definitions are more fluid, and they're from the ITE manual. They're not our definitions.
Right.
Would you be comfortable with the ITE definitions and saying, all these terms as defined by the ITE manual, as opposed to like putting in, and the reason that I'm hesitant to put in our own definitions is because the ITE changes the way they define stuff on a
Correct.
regular basis.
Yeah.
So there's that.
I would somehow just want to incorporate whatever's already existing by the ITE, because I guess.
As
if
a
I-
base.
Right. If I'm looking at it as proposed, to me, when I look at this ordinance as proposed, that's not part and parcel to it, and there's no reference to, that, I don't want to say legal definition, but legal definition as to what that means. And if there is a legal definition or a reference to that, then there's no subjectivity because it's defined in black and white. I don't necessarily agree with the rates, but I know that that's not up for discussion right now. But I think the streamlined process could be beneficial.
Susanna, when
Yes.
would subjectivity come into play, and where is there a benefit for that versus having it, as we talked about, exactly as the manual indicates?
All right, so right now, the way that it works right now, again, the process that today, so an applicant comes in today, and let's say that it's a smaller project, that is a change of use, right? A change of use that is an existing building that they're just changing from one thing to another, say a warehouse to an office space, right? And there would be an intensification in the use. Because I am not a traffic engineer, and we do not have a traffic engineer on staff, and we never have, and it would be very expensive for the town to have a traffic engineer on staff, I would have to ask the applicant to go and get a traffic engineer to do a trip calculation study for him. Not a full traffic study, which could cost them $20,000, but a trip calculation study. It's a small calculation. Most engineers will charge anywhere between $2,000 and $3,000 for this. It's the normal going rate. When they bring me this traffic study that has a calculation in it, as per the ITE manual, this calculation will include things like assumptions that the engineer is making as to the type of customer that is coming in. It's going to include assumptions based on the urbanization of the area, whether it's a dense area or a less dense area. This is where they apply all these rates and all these discounts, basically. So they take off trips for this and take off trips. And so the number that you end up getting is a number that this engineer has used a lot of assumptions to arrive at. So they start with the ITE number, and then they start applying different assumptions to it until they come up with a number that they think is appropriate for the use, or for what their client has told them the use is going to be. Does this make any sense yet? They bring it to me, I bring it to our own consultant traffic engineer, and I give it to them. They look at the assumptions, they look at the formulation of the numbers, and they tell me, well, they did this, I agree with this, but this assumption that they made, where they assumed that they were going to have an 80% pass-by rate, I disagree with. I think this area is going to have a 60% pass-by rate. And by this I mean that the original engineer has decided to decrease the number of trips by 80% because many people are going to be driving by. And my engineer is saying that the pass-by rate should be only 60%. So as you can see, and this is a true story. I'm not going to cite this particular applicant, but this is a true story that has happened to me. And when you have two engineers discussing such wide-ranging numbers, and I'm tasked to attach this to a dollar amount, it makes me very, very nervous as staff that that it's not subjectivity. I hope it's not my subjectivity first. As staff, so I don't want to put anybody on the position to have to be subjective with such large amounts. And at the same time, which one, I'm going to trust my consultant, yes, but at the same time, what do you see what I'm saying? So this is where I'm talking about subjectivity and what I'm talking about. That's why I think we believe that maybe establishing a base rate, where if you go with this, we don't even argue, is how we want to at least have a beginning of a conversation about it. And then, obviously,
Through the chair, so based on what you're telling me, we can assume as well that most of the time when an applicant is hiring an engineer, they're going to share with them their narrative as to how many trips, and they're always going to push that to make the report, the results of the report come back with less
Correct.
trips than what may be the case.
you would assume.
Any other questions? On the other observation that I forgot to mention before, there's no distinguishment either on the multifamily, if it's 1 bedroom or 3 bedroom units.
Multifamily, the ITA manual does not provide
Doesn't
a change in whether they're larger units or smaller units. The place where the most difference in trips is whether the homes have children in them or not. So homes that have children on them have a lot higher rates of trips than homes where only adults live. So for that reason, and because we cannot really regulate who lives in the homes and it would be against the Fair Housing Act, we don't even discuss it like that, because it's not really something we can work with. For that reason, we are dividing it into single family. The single family and the townhome, there's no real discernible difference between them. So we took the average of the two. And the multifamily, it's more a matter, like the differences in multifamily is more a matter of density. So the higher the density, the lower the trip rates. The lower the density, so in our area is like a low medium density. So we're on the higher end of the trip rates because our density is lower.
If I can, the chart that begins on page 15, where you're starting to eliminate, the reason, and you touched on this briefly, the reason that those items are being eliminated are because it's almost impossible to monitor and police that, if you will,
Correct.
for lack of a better word. So it's tightening it up. The downside to that, if you were an applicant?
So there's a beauty of providing credits for wonderful things like giving your employees transit passes, right? There's certainly, I can see the spirit of that, because if you're providing your employees transit passes, or your students, it's certainly reducing the amount of people that are going to be driving into your use. However, the problem with that, the flip side of that is that it's very difficult for us as a town to enforce, to make sure that those transit passes are being provided, that they're being provided on a timely basis, that people are being that the people are not being charged for them, that there's, so how do we keep their feet to the fire, that they're continuously going to be doing that they're going to be doing that this year, next year, the year after, and 10 years from now. And that's why these credits are more difficult for us. And short of me going every year and holding a survey of their employees and asking them whether they're coming in carpooling together or it's really not reasonable to expect that we would even know that these things are happening in 5 years. So giving them credits, even if modest credits for any of these things, seems a little ludicrous in a way. So we're trying to remove the credits that are difficult to enforce and trying to add credits that really do make a difference to the town, like making new sidewalks and making bicycle facilities and making providing more tangible things.
And by making these adjustments, those that have already realized those credits, does it impact them in any way?
No, not at this time. Those would be grandfathered in at this time, yeah.
I'm sorry. Through the chair, thank you. So the way I understand it, I think this method of calculating the mobility fee is going to save, so the large national brands may not be using this method. It would be more for a change of use, a smaller mom and pop shop, where instead of them spending those $3,000 or $2,000 plus the peer review, we would be, the town would be collecting it, and it would save the applicant that money. And we-
Correct. So we wouldn't be collecting the money that they would be spending on the engineer, because that would be unnecessary at that point. But we would be able to collect the mobility fee
Right.
without putting the applicant through three rows of hoops in order to be able to arrive at a number as to what their fee would be.
And just one other thing, I mean, they have the ability, to actually challenge it and bring their own engineer
Yes, ma'am.
and appeal it and
Yes,
do all
ma'am.
that. So if they challenge the rate that's proposed or the method that's imposed upon them, they have the right to challenge that and even appeal the ultimate decision anyways.
Yes, ma'am.
The numbers on the chart, though, that would stay unless the council decides to, on the chart.
So the numbers on the chart, on the initial chart that you're looking at, are based on the ITE manual. Those would have to be considered to maybe because those are coming from the ITE manual. These are not numbers that we are proposing because that are changeable by us. Does that make any sense? The numbers have to be, so in order for this legislation, and I wish Lorenzo was here right now, but I'm going to try to explain this. In order for for the mobility fee to be defensible in court and to be legal as per the state of Florida statutes, it has to hold to the double nexus test. Basically, it has to have its basis, has to be on defensible and defensible calculations. We can't really just come up with our own trip numbers, no matter how. So that's why basing it on the ITE manual, which is the standard for calculating of trips, is what we need to do for these numbers to be legalized.
Right, but what I'm saying is these numbers would be fixed, the 9.44, or whatever number the council decides to put on this chart, that number's not going to change. What may change is the rate that we charge per trip going forward.
Correct.
So if
Correct.
the ordinance passes as drafted right now, in the future, it's a matter of taking the figure on this chart and then multiplying it by this mean auto occupancy thing,
Correct.
and then multiplying on whatever the per trip value is.
Correct.
That per trip value is adjusted how often?
Every 3 years.
Every 3 years.
Yes, which is what they're doing right now at the same time.
Right.
And we're taking advantage of the opportunity to even clean up the text a little.
Okay.
And then through the chair, you're taking this opportunity because of that 3-year increment to clean this up and fine tune it.
Correct. And also because we've had the value of 3 whole years of being utilizing the ordinance as is written right now. And so we have a little bit of first-hand knowledge as to what works, what doesn't work, and what could be done better, and what kind of situations we are putting applicants and staff through.
I mean, again, my only concern is setting a very high bar with the fast food example. Just as my personal opinion is just, if you do it based on that number, and so that creates some doubt as to how those numbers came about. Obviously, I'm not a traffic engineer. I'm nowhere near capacitated to argue any of these things. I just did the math, and it just didn't seem like a financially feasible
Pretty hard.
in that particular instance. Now, when you do the residential or something like that, it does look very reasonable. But that it is what it is.
Under concurrency, that's what they would be paying with, because the concurrency pays for, they calculate the trips in the same way in that sense. So the level of service, do you see what I'm saying? So those trips would be what they throw into the level of service of the adjoining roadways. So a fast food restaurant usually has a very high impact on the surrounding areas, and they end up paying a lot of money in road impact fees as well. So
No, I know, and what happens, just the restaurant industry as a whole, this is one impact fee. There's also, which is completely irrelevant, but there's a per chair water impact fee. So it gets to the point where building a new restaurant is cost prohibitive, almost, when everything comes, which is beyond our purview here, but here, I guess they would just hire a traffic engineer, and I'm sure he'll come up with a hell of a lot lower number.
most likely.
One more quick question through the chair, and you mentioned this. If there is a dispute, if you will, and the applicant has a right to appeal, does it hold them up?
Say that
They can
again?
begin their project if there's been no agreement because a permit can't be issued.
I
Is that
can't,
correct?
I'm so sorry, but I can't hear you very well.
If there's a dispute and
Yes.
they're appealing,
Yes.
nothing goes forward, is that correct?
So the concurrency fee, usually we calculate at the same time that we're reviewing their site plan. It doesn't really, because there's always something wrong with their site plan. There's always a parking space that is too narrow or you understand. So this happens at the same time. I usually, my personal procedure in the 3 years that I've been doing site plan review in Miami Lakes, I usually do the mobility fee at beginning, so that they can start arguing with me at that point. And then by the time we get to the site plan approval time, whether it has to go to council or it has to is an administrative approval, we already have all those things ironed out. So it gives them time to come up with a number and go and get their engineer. Now, it depends on whether or not their engineer takes forever and these things. There's things that are out of our control that, yes, it would hold them up. However, it doesn't prevent them from getting a site plan approval. It gets them from getting a permit. So
Right.
what they need to get, the mobility fee has to be paid prior to permitting, not prior to site plan approval. And no, in that sense, it wouldn't necessarily hold them up because they would be doing construction drawings at that time. It does, however, at this point, because until we have consolidated the number of trips that they're going to be paying a mobility fee on, they are not able to maybe decide whether the project is feasible or not, because sometimes the mobility fee comes up pretty high. They do get very skittish and start getting nervous until they have that number solidified. They're not so happy to go ahead and start paying for construction drawings, for example, which can also be quite a chunk of change. So
Any other questions? We could entertain a motion. We could entertain a motion to suggest approval with
I think
whatever we
I would
want.
do a motion to approve it, but with the definitions as we described, pursuant to the ITE.
I'd second that.
Okay. So there's a motion has been made to accept with the inclusion of the ITE definitions. Has been seconded
Second.
by Member Fernandez.
Okay.
I don't know if we need discussion on the motion. You could call, I would call the roll.
Okay. Board Member Yanis?
Yes.
Board Member Fernandez?
Yes.
Board Member De La Sera, he's on here. Okay, Vice Chairman Matos?
Yes.
Chairman Julia?
We also need Board Member Leoncio.
Oh, I'm sorry, Board Member Leoncio.
Yes.
Okay, Chairman Julia.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, you got 2 minutes if there's a director's report. If not, we have to adjourn.
there will be no director's report today.
Okay. So at this point, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.